Greetings, everyone, and welcome. I'm Hari-kirtana. Welcome to Bhagavad-gita Satsang. It is an honor for me to be here with you and a privilege to have you here with me. Thank you very, very much for choosing to spend a little bit of your time with me. I trust that I can be heard, but not enough to go on without getting some reassurance from you. If you would be kind enough to raise your hands. Thank you very much. I want to especially send out congratulations to all of you who have been realizing the power of saying no and taking a break from social media. Congratulations. Those are two very difficult things to do. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, let's take care of our housekeeping business. So for those of you who are new to the satsang, you can adjust your audio settings and viewing options up in the upper right-hand corner. Not to worry about your micro video camera because you can see or at least hear me, but I cannot see or hear you. And if you would like to be heard, please type a question or comment into the chat window or the Q&A box. I have both of them up and I will see whatever comments or questions you have either way. And oops, our next order of business is for me to tell you what we did last time. For those of you who were here last time, I know this is an adventure in the Department of Redundancy Department. Nevertheless, this is how we roll. We talked about how the light in me is the light in you, and one of my favorite pet peeves, and so far as the language of modern yoga and how it is used. And not to be outdone, my next favorite pet peeve, if not even my number one pet peeve, at least as far as the Bhagavad-gita goes, is coming up this evening. So I'm very excited about that because yet again, I have something to complain about. I just live for that. Last week, we also spoke about material nature as the cause of effects, the soul as the cause of effects in a different light, and the relationship of the soul and material nature. We covered verses 15 through 21 or 16 through 22, depending on how the verses in the 13th chapter are numbered in your edition of Bhagavad-gita. This evening, we're going to talk a little bit more about the Param Atma, because Krishna will speak a little bit more about the Param Atma, or the Supreme Self, also referred to as the Supreme Lord in these verses. And Krishna will continue to speak about his own expansion, basically another version of himself in the third person. We'll speak a little bit more about the process of knowledge. There'll be a whole lot of selfing going on. This is the Jerry Lee Lewis portion of our Bhagavad-gita program. And we'll speak a little bit about the relationship of spiritual vision to ethics, how we treat others based on how we see them. We will cover verses 22 through 28 by my count, 23 to 29 by your count, if you have an edition that counts that way. Either way, we will chant our invocation mantra. So for those of you who are new to Sanskrit diacritical marks, for the transliterated Sanskrit, the dot over the M indicates that we close the back of our tongues against the back of the roof of our mouths at the same time that we bring our lips together in front. The bar across the top of a vowel, in this case an A, indicates a long open version of that vowel sound as opposed to a shorter, more compressed version when the bar is not present. So with that, I will chant, and if you like, you can chant back. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Translation: I offer my respects to the Supreme Person, the Son of Vasudeva, who is the all-pervading transcendence. Just to give you a little insight about how I experience this invocation mantra, as I am the speaker in this particular instance, and I have the responsibility of saying something that's worth the price of admission for you. I use this as an opportunity to ask the son of Vasudeva, Krishna, to somehow or other empower me to speak nicely, to convey his message in a way that is suitable for your favorable reception. So from my standpoint, that's the significance of this invocation mantra and how I take advantage of this opportunity to be reminded that what I'm telling you is that I'm not the one who's doing things, because none of us are the ones who are actually doing things. And since I'm telling you this, I ought to remember it for myself, that whatever of value is showing up in these classes, it's coming through me, but it's not because I'm making it happen. So we're going to proceed with chapter 13, verses 22 through 29, depending on how you count it. First, a word from our sponsor. My next 300-hour advanced yoga teacher training is now open for enrollment. So if you are interested in finding out more about this training, which will be conducted from February 28th to the 27th of September 2020, with me and a great faculty and some special surprise guests, teachers, you can visit my website, Hari-kirtan.com/advanced-yoga-teacher-training-2020. And I will pop that into the chat for you to copy and paste for those of you who are here with me live and might have an interest in that. And with that, we return to our regularly scheduled program, which is already in progress. So last week we finished with this verse: a person thus situated in material nature experiences a mode of being born of that nature, clinging to an identity that arises from the qualities of material nature one meets with good and evil in the course of taking birth among various species. So there's just so much excellent information here, and it brought up some questions after the fact. One of the things I wanted to point out here is that the first word, the first Sanskrit word of this verse is purusha. The second is prakriti. So there are a couple of different ways to understand these two words, purusha and prakriti. Purusha means person, and prakriti means material nature, the material energy. Sometimes prakriti is also understood to mean the marginal energy that is us. The jivatma is sometimes also called prakriti. So we are energetic emanations from the absolute truth, from the Supreme Person. And as such, in that sense, we can be thought of as prakriti. However, because we are created in God's image, and the Supreme Person is a person, we also have this attribute of being a person. Therefore, we can also be considered as purusha as well. And in this verse, we see a nice example of how purusha means person, as in jivatma, or you and I, because only you and I would be situated in material nature, experiencing a mode of being born of that nature. That sort of thing does not happen to the Purushottama, the ultimate person. So that's the first thing I wanted to point out. And then we had an interesting question about inherited trauma and samskaras. And we spoke just briefly about it. And I wanted to bring it up again, just because it's an interesting way to think about how we are born into a particular nature according to our karma, and we cling to an identity based on the impressions on the mind that we carry from previous lives. And then the question arises, how do the impressions on the minds of our parents affect the impressions on the mind that we then carry into our own lives? And the honest answer is, I'm not really sure how that relationship works. It's a kind of topic that invites speculation that I am loath to get into, precisely because it's speculation. What I do understand is the principle that our karma lays out a path for us, and then we receive the material body with its genetic makeup that's suitable for the realization, or the manifestation, I should say, of that karma. Technically, we don't have much to do with what is happening with our minds and bodies. When I say we, I mean the spirit soul proper. And we're going to get more into that in our next class. The mind is not who we are. And anyway, so the relationship between our own impressions of the mind that we carry and the genes that we inherit from our parents that make up our physical body, that bring the external manifestation of this, or give us this particular psychology that we have, is really hard to pin down. And rarely do we know anything about our past lives or anything like that with any certainty that will allow us to see a direct correlation between these things. Anyway, I just wanted to revisit this because I was thinking about it during the course of the week. And like I said, I really don't have a definitive answer for that. But if anyone else has some thoughts or some scriptural references to this sort of thing, or any other insights on this, I would certainly be interested in hearing about them. Which brings us to any questions you might have on this topic, or as we move forward, I will read the translations for our verses this evening, and then come back and go into each of these in detail. But before I do, I'm going to rephrase the question in the form of a question that I don't have an answer for. So the question is, what is the relationship between our own samskaras that we bring from a previous life and the genetic makeup that we inherit from our parents that is also has relationship to their samskaras, the impressions in their mind? And how do these things correspond to one another? And my answer is, I think, there may be a demigod who knows how to sort that out, and that's not me. So anyway, Tulsi Priya, take a shot at it and let me know what you think. And thank you once again for being here with me this evening. All right. Translation time. So we begin with text 22 or 23 of the 13th chapter. Translation: Krishna continues to speak to Arjuna. There is yet another in this body, the witness, sustainer, and giver of consent, the transcendental enjoyer, known as the Supreme Self, who is the highest person. Text 23 or 24. Whoever understands this philosophy concerning the person, material nature, and the interactions of the qualities of material nature will surely attain liberation. Regardless of their present position, they will not take birth here again. Text 24 or 25. Some see the Supreme Self within themselves by means of meditation, others through the yoga of analytical study, and still others through the yoga of action. Text 25 or 26. Still others, without spiritual knowledge, begin to worship the Supreme Person upon hearing about him from others. They too surely transcend the path of death by virtue of their attraction to hearing. Text 26 or 27. O best of the Bharatas, know that whatever comes into being, be it moving or non-moving, exists due to the union of the field of activities with the knower of the field. 27 or 28. One who sees the same Supreme Lord residing within all living beings, who sees the imperishable within the perishable, actually sees. Text 28 or 29. Indeed, one who sees the same Supreme Lord equally present everywhere does not allow the self to become degraded by the mind. Thus, one approaches the transcendental destination. All right. So now let's go back to verse 22 or 23, as the case may be. And the translation again. There is yet another in this body, the witness, sustainer, and giver of consent, the transcendental enjoyer, known as the Supreme Self, who is the highest person. One of the challenges that we have in modern life, in modern yoga, is the idea of hierarchies in transcendence. We are by our very nature spiritual, and in our natural condition, we are transcendental. We transcend this material nature, but we've lost touch with that natural state of being, and therefore we are under the influence of material nature. But once we get to transcendence, we're back to the desire for everything to be very egalitarian, for everything to be equal, everybody's on an equal level. But there's one person who's not on an equal level, and that's the Supreme Person, according to Krishna. That person is the highest person. That is the one without a second, is a phrase that we often hear in discussions of Vedanta and conceptions of the highest truth in Vedanta. And in Bhakti Yoga, we understand that to mean one without a second. That is, there's no one who compares to this person, as opposed to the idea that there is no other, which is a very different conception. And it kind of undermines the whole idea of a highest person, because if there is no other, there's no one to be higher than. And there's a clear indication of this kind of hierarchy and transcendence in these verses. And it's hierarchy in transcendence, not in the conventional mundane sense. So it would take quite a bit of word jugglery and logical contortions to come up with absolute oneness where there's hierarchy and transcendence. The idea of a witness, that is to say, someone who sees what we see and sees what we do, and hears what we hear, smells what we smell. This is a way to be reminded of how our own material bodies are temples, are the abode of the Paramatma, the Supreme Person. Because if we're in here, the Supreme Person is also in here. And when we're really cognizant of this, that's going to change our behavior. You know, it's only due to the illusion of independence, the illusion of separation, of not being connected to reality, basically, that we can go about our business without paying any attention to the fact that we're not alone, that we're never alone, that there's always the Supreme Person acting as our companion, very best friend, going with us wherever we go. How many people do you know will go with you wherever you go, anytime? Not many. You know, if you want to find out who your friends are, then move and ask people to come and help you move. And, you know, then you see who shows up, and then you know. At least that's conventional wisdom. Well, the Supreme Person will move with you wherever you go, from the beginning of time until the end of time. And plays the role of sustainer and the person who gives consent. That is to say, the one who gives permission for anything you want to do to be done. Krishna also describes this person as the transcendental enjoyer. So this is another way to think about purusha and prakriti. Purusha also can be understood to indicate the one who is enjoying. And the Paramatma is the transcendental enjoyer. That is to say, doesn't really take any pleasure in the material world the way we try to take pleasure in the material world. But rather, the Supreme Person is completely self-satisfied, and yet is still hankering for a relationship with us, and has already taken the first step in making that relationship happen simply by being with us, by hanging with us. Let me know if you have any questions or comments on this conception of a witness sustainer, one who gives permission, transcendental enjoyer, the highest person living within our hearts. While I wait for your questions and comments, we have one lengthy comment that I will make sure I come back to as time permits. The next verse: whoever understands this philosophy concerning the person, material nature, the interactions of the qualities of material nature will surely attain liberation. Regardless of their present position, they will not take birth here again. So, so far, Krishna has spoken about two people: the person who takes birth in the material world and assumes an identity and clings to that identity based on the influence of the qualities of material nature, and the highest person, who is the super soul or the supreme person within the heart of that person. So whoever understands this philosophy concerning the person, well, there's a couple of people to choose from in this case. Material nature and the interactions of the qualities of material nature. So there's the stuff of which the material world is made, and then there's the innumerable ways in which those the qualities of material nature can interact. So Krishna is making an interesting, fine distinction here between material nature as a general principle and the qualities of material nature and the interactions of those qualities. And that sounds to me like a fairly complex thing. The wisdom texts of yoga will often begin not with an understanding of what's going on this level of spirit, but rather on the level of matter. So in the Yoga Sutras, we begin with the definition of yoga and the reason why you should do yoga, because then you will experience yourself as you truly are. What's the alternative? Well, then you're going to be under the influence of the qualities of material nature in these various states of minds that it produces. And then we get immediately an understanding of yoga psychology, how the material mind works. In the Srimad Bhagavatam, the book, the set of books that are right behind me, the inquiries made by the primary conversationalist begin with inquiries not about the spiritual world, but the material world. So we begin with understanding the material cosmic manifestation. Why? Well, two reasons. One is because it's proof of concept. It's what we can experience, but we can take what we hear in terms of transcendental knowledge about how the world works, and then we look at the world and we can see it. You can develop the ability to see the qualities of material nature at work. It changes the way you look at the world. And when you see the world differently, then you're going to start thinking, wow, this knowledge has something to it. And the process of realizing this knowledge, of actually making it experiential knowledge, there's also something to that. So it's very encouraging to begin with an understanding of the world of our experience and be given a lens to look at it differently in order to understand that our faith is reasonable. in order to get verification by direct perception that what we are hearing about the nature of spirit and matter is verifiable. So that's the first reason. The second reason is because it actually gives us a sense of the scope of the Supreme Person's immeasurable power. Because the material world is inconceivable to us. A physicist, someone with a very big brain, can specialize in a small portion of reality, material reality, and dig deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper to try to understand this one facet of how some aspect of the material world works. And they can develop a career that takes an entire lifetime doing this. And at the end of it, they still won't be completely satisfied that they've understood everything. And that's just one little part of the material world. And then there's the whole rest of the material world. And Krishna has described the material world as his inferior separated energies. In other words, he's not so impressed by it. It's not like the best, most amazing part of what he can do. And it's completely beyond us. So when we get an appreciation for the complexity and the scope of the material world, then we can begin to appreciate just how amazing the creator of the material world must be. Now, here's the other thing about this verse. It sounds like we've got an out here. All you have to do is understand this philosophy about the person and material nature and the qualities of material nature and their interactions, and then you will surely attain liberation. Irrespective of where you're at now, if you understand this, you won't take birth here again. That's great, because I understand that. You might understand that. Except, what does it mean to understand this? Well, if you understand it, then it's going to change how you act. You can't just say, yeah, sure, I understand it, and then act in the same way as before you got this information, because that means you really didn't understand it, or at least you didn't accept it. But here's the other thing. Krishna has already laid down the mandatory prerequisite for understanding this, to actually understand it. He's told Arjuna, because you are my devotee as well as my friend, you can understand this transcendental science that I am repeating for your benefit. So to really understand this on an experiential level, bhakti, devotional service, has to be there. That's the key to understanding this for real. And there are principles of bhakti yoga that one has to put into practice in order to actually become a bhakti yogi. So it's not just sentimental, there's a discipline to it. So it's not really an out. It's not an off the hook that, oh, now I don't have to surrender to the Supreme Person. I can forget about the whole Ishvara Pranidhana thing and all of Krishna's entreaties to become his devotee. No, you still have to do that, because otherwise you're not going to understand this. And we will not attain liberation simply by a theoretical understanding that does not affect how we live, what we do. So I have this little sticky note that is meant to be a reminder that I should smile more often when I'm on camera with all of you, rather than looking so serious all the time. Even though we're discussing a serious subject matter, you know, I don't want to come off as some grumpy old yoga guy. All right, now I smiled. Let's move on. Now I'm going to get grumpy, because the next verse says, some see the Supreme Self within themselves by means of meditation, others through the yoga of analytical study, and still others through the yoga of action. So, 3 different ways that a yogi may see the Supreme Self. Through meditation, through the focusing of the mind on the attributes of the Supreme Person, which attributes have to be there in order to have something to meditate on. Through analytical study, process of elimination, understanding the distinction between spirit and matter. Sankhya yoga is what Krishna is specifically referring to, the yoga of discernment between spirit and matter, among other things. And still others through the yoga of action, karma yoga, which means the yoga of acting without attachment and offering the fruits of actions and ultimately action itself to the Supreme Person. So, why am I going to get grumpy, you ask? Here's why. This is the most popular quote from the Bhagavad-gita that one is likely to see on social media. Yoga is the journey of the self through the self to the self. It is never attributed because there is no verse that actually says this, but my conviction is that this is a tangled up version of the first third of this verse that we are studying now, rendered in a manner as to render it illogical and incomprehensible. Yoga is the journey of the self through the self to the self. I just don't see a way of thinking about this that is ever actually going to satisfy any kind of rational thinking. And there are just so many of these inspirational posters or images or graphics, Pinterest posts, whatever you call these. I mean, I think about half of these have come from either Facebook or Pinterest in all of their various glories and mishmashes. I'm particularly impressed by how it's been conflated with Buddhism and luxury vacations to fancy beaches. Anyway, a more coherent way of understanding this verse is this translation, that the self sees the Supreme Self by means of directing the mind. Now, the word Atma is what is being used here on a couple of times in this verse, and that's where we get this, the self going through the self to the self stuff, because the word Atma keeps showing up. So Atma is a Sanskrit word that can be defined in many different ways depending on the context in which it is used. So here, there are variations of the word Atma, and they indicate the Supreme Self, who is the object of the meditation of the mind. So Atma can mean mind, Atma can mean self, Atma can refer to the Supreme Self, Atma can even refer to the body in the right context. There are some people, and we'll get to this in a moment, who have some rule about synonyms that I've never really been able to understand, where you can just use the same exact word over and over and over again. But I don't subscribe to this idea. I subscribe to the idea that we have a reasonable expectation that things should make sense and be comprehensible, and that Krishna, when he speaks, is saying stuff that actually makes sense. So that's why I think it's important to have a translation that contextualizes words that appear to be synonyms, and why I've gone out of my way to render some kind of English translation, be it a word or a phrase, of words that are particularly difficult to translate into English. This is the value of being connected to a tradition where you have the opportunity to hear from teachers that, by virtue of their having heard from teachers who have realization and insight into the intention of these verses, insight into how these verses are practically applicable, understood properly, so that you can do something about them. The way I prepare for these classes during the course of the week is I listen to classes by my own teachers who know far more about the Bhagavad-gita than I can ever hope to. And what you hear from me is a kind of mashup of what I have heard from them. And hopefully some of their realization is passing through me to you. Any questions or comments about these verses, or this verse, and my take on this very popular quote? Please go ahead and put something up in the chat or in the Q&A, or if you are listening on the phone, please send me an email if you have any questions. This brings us to our next verse. This is the verse that we are going to chant this evening. And let's say another word or two about the diacritical marks in the transliterated Sanskrit that give us pronunciation cues. A dot under an H at the end of a word, at the end of a line, means that a short version of the vowel that precedes the H is echoed back. Now, technically, the first line is not the end of the line. So from a very technical standpoint, that might not actually be the case. It would count if it appeared at the end of the second line, but I'm going to echo it back anyway, just to not confuse you with these technicalities. It's there, it's at the end of a line, we'll do it. The accent mark over an S indicates a deep SH sound from the back of one's mouth, as opposed to a regular SH sound, which is a little more high-pitched, sh. And the regular SH sound would appear if the S had a dot underneath it, which does not occur in this verse. An apostrophe indicates that a vowel has been dropped in order to create a connection between the word that precedes the apostrophe and the next word. So the vowel at the end of a word will now merge directly into the word that has the apostrophe in front of it. A Y at the end of a word is going to be a Y sound that will then move directly into the vowel at the beginning of the next word, as opposed to the Y creating an E sound. A dot under an R means you're going to draw your tongue back towards the 2/3 back in the roof of your mouth, as opposed to with your teeth out in front of your lower lip. And a dot under an N is more of a sound, where the middle of your tongue is going to go up against the middle of the roof of your mouth, as opposed to a N sound with your tongue right behind your teeth. And that covers that. So I will chant each line, and if you like, you can chant each line back. Anye tveva, Anye tvevam ajanantaha. Shrutvanyebhya upasate. Te pichati tarantyeva. Mrityum shruti parayangaha. Translation. Still others without spiritual knowledge begin to worship the Supreme Person upon hearing about him from others. They too surely transcend the path of death by virtue of their attraction to hearing. So this is a wonderful, wonderful verse, and a very important verse. In Bhakti Yoga, the very first process is hearing. And this is actually how one begins their practice on the path of spiritual knowledge, by hearing from someone. And in order to continue to make progress, it's essential that we cultivate a taste for hearing topics of transcendental knowledge. We are habituated to hearing about topics of mundane knowledge. And there's certainly no shortage of mundane knowledge, mundane information. Most of it, whatever is of value today, will be of no value tomorrow. And whatever is of value tomorrow will be of no value later on in the week. We live in an environment of about a 5-minute news cycle, been shortened from 15 minutes as opposed to 24 hours. And we just get bombarded with stuff that is, just gonna disappear. And the difference between transient mundane knowledge and transcendental knowledge is that transcendental knowledge retains its value beyond the next news cycle. It retains its value beyond this one lifetime. Because when we make impressions on the mind with transcendental knowledge, well, we ride the impressions of the mind to our next birth or to our next destination. And if we impress upon our mind enough transcendental knowledge, it actually will dissolve the mind altogether, because remember, we're not the mind. So if you want to dissolve your material mind and reveal to yourself your true spiritual nature, just bombard your mind with transcendental knowledge. Now, hearing is important. And in order to cultivate this taste for hearing that Krishna is speaking about, the principles of Bhakti Yoga that guide the practice of Bhakti Yoga, once again, are in play. the great sage who recites the Srimad Bhagavatam, this big set of books behind me, tells his audience that he was present when he heard his teacher speak this Srimad Bhagavatam, and that he heard him with rapt attention. And thus, by the mercy of his teacher, he learned the Bhagavatam from that sage. And now, because he is the speaker to a new audience, he says, I'm going to try to make you hear the very same thing that I heard as I learned it from him and as I realized it. So it's not just a question of hearing and repeating. It's not just a game of telephone. It's a matter of hearing with rapt attention, with complete absorption in the subject matter, and then moving through the world on the basis of what you hear so that you have some realizations, so that now you can make others hear the same thing that you heard or learned, but you're not going to use the same language, the same words to make them hear that very same thing that were used to make you hear it, because it has to come out in your own voice according to your own realization. So it is the same thing. Anything that I'm sharing with you about the Bhagavad-gita is the exact same. I'm hoping that you will hear exactly what I heard, even though I am not using the same exact words. And in order for what I say to have some depth to it, some actual punch to it, then I have to be hearing with rapt attention. And in order for me to be able to hear with that kind of intensity, I have to develop a taste. And in order for me to develop a taste for hearing, there are principles that go with this hearing that guide my behavior. And this is where we get to ethics. Ethics are principles that guide moral decision-making. And this is one of the reasons why the process of yoga, engagement with the material world, also prescribes a way of dealing with the material world that is designed to purify our hearts and clarify our minds, so that not only will we hear properly, but that we will hear with enthusiasm, with some what is known as rapt attention. So I'll get a little bit more into that in our next class when we do a review of the entire chapter. I can see, based on the clock, that we will probably not get through everything that I had planned on getting through. No, that's all right, actually. We've got 3 more verses to go and just one comment. So let's see how we do in the next 5 minutes. Any questions? Please feel free to throw my time frame completely off by asking a question, because I'm always happy to have questions. All right. Meanwhile, text 26 or 27, as the case may be. O best of the Bharatas, know that whatever comes into being, be it moving or non-moving, exists due to the union of the field of activities and the knower of the field. And then 27 or 28. One who sees the same Supreme Lord residing within all living beings, who sees the imperishable within the perishable, actually sees. So this is spiritual vision, being able to see that everything that exists in the material world is coming into existence by virtue of this union between between matter and spirit. Matter by itself doesn't do anything. So this verse, pretty much this 27 or 26, pretty much undercuts the whole idea of matter doing stuff all by itself, reorganizing itself into something that becomes self-aware. There has to be consciousness or a knower of the field involved in the process from the get-go in order for something to come into being. So this is the essential tension between modern thinking and traditional thinking. Modern thinking says matter just happens to be by pure chance and acts on its own without any conscious entity engaging with it and becomes stuff. And here what we're hearing from Krishna is just the opposite, that matter does nothing on its own, and that if something comes into existence, consciousness has to be involved right from the start. The knower of the field has to be there. And then, now this is a second aspect of ethics. One who sees the same Supreme Lord residing with all living beings, and who sees the imperishable, that is to say, the Supreme Person and the eternal spiritual person, within the perishable, meaning the body, actually sees. So someone who sees people as not being their bodies, people who see the Supreme Person within the heart of all persons, that person is seeing things as they are, and that's going to change how you act towards other people. So the rule of ahimsa, nonviolence towards others, is actually meant for facilitating our ability to see what Krishna is telling us about, what we are hearing from Krishna, and also is the natural response to seeing precisely that way. Then our last verse, 28 or 29, indeed, one who sees the same Supreme Lord equally present everywhere does not allow the self to become degraded by the mind, and thus one approaches the transcendental destination. So once again, this verse has a lot of atmas in it. So this is a whole lot of selfing going on, in that several of these verses have a repetition of atma, which can lend itself to an interpretation that the self is the supreme self, or that the self comes to the self from the self, and it's all the same self, because it's all one self, even though there are all these selves selving away at whatever they're selfing doing. Do not be confused by all this selfing, and do not let the rule of synonyms lull you into a sense of it's all Atma. Be discerning, make a distinction. And hear these verses from someone who can contextualize these words so that they come out making sense, instead of sounding like yoga is the journey of the self through the self to the self. All right. Just on time delivery. I share with you once again, in order to tell you that that's all, folks. That was tonight's class. We heard more about the Paramatma, about the process of knowledge, hearing, and the relationship of ethics to the clearing of the mind, and a whole lot of selfing going on. Verses 22 through 28 or 23 through 29. Thank you very much for staying with me for this hour and reassuring me that grumpy is good. I always appreciate that, because that is my default condition. If you have any questions, I'll stick around for a few extra minutes and entertain those questions. If you have questions after the fact, please send them to me at hari@harikirtana.com. I am always very happy to hear from you. Our next class will be on Thursday, September 19th. We're going to skip a week. I have an obligation, an engagement that I must attend. And unfortunately, I do not have the ability to expand myself into another one of me that can do the class while I am at this engagement. So we're going to skip a week and reconvene on the following Thursday, September 19th, at which time we will finish up chapter 13. The self as the not so innocent bystander will be one of the topics we cover. How spirit and matter are like oil and water. We will conclude and review chapter 13 before we move on to the next portion of the Bhagavad-gita. So last call for questions. Okay, time's up. You better type fast with me. Thank you all very, very much for choosing to spend your time with me. It's always a great honor to have you here with me and a great pleasure for me to spend this time with you. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening, and I look forward to hearing from you soon and seeing you here next time. And I'm going to remember to smile.